Hi guys, so let's now take a look at price discrimination. So price discrimination can be used by an imperfectly competitive firm to actually determine a different price for one group of consumers against another. Now it involves charging a different price to each of those different consumer groups. Now it really aims to firstly increase revenue and profit. Secondly, it helps to improve the cash flow, and thirdly, it helps to make sure that you're using up spare capacity. So if you think about, for instance, a hotel which may experience a bit of a down period during the week, then what they're likely to, of course, do is reduce their prices, and at the weekend they would then increase their prices. So it helps to actually utilize that spare capacity, but this is also true for trains and planes, and the way in which the pricing structure works between peak and off-peak periods. We'll come on to more of that in just a moment. But that's how you help to use up that spare capacity, because otherwise those seats are empty, those beds are empty in the hotel, and so on. Right, next up, you've really got to understand these necessary conditions for price discrimination to be able to occur. Now, firms have price making power, and that is crucial. So the firms do have price making power, and that may be because they are unique, or it may be because there is a lack of substitutability. But certainly there's going to be a lot of demand for the product to enjoy for the firm during that peak period. Okay, so the lack of substitutability means that you cannot easily go to a competitor based product. Secondly, you're going to be able to easily separate customers into specific groups. So we mentioned with regard to hotels and flights, and of course during the summer holidays and the half-term breaks, the price of a flight of course increases quite significantly. So that's another great example. When it comes to the cinema, going to the cinema on a Friday or Saturday is of course far more expensive than if you go on a Tuesday morning. Now, number three, there's going to be varying elasticities of demand in some markets where this is actually undertaken as well, and that's a very, very important characteristic to be aware of. Okay, so when it comes to first degree price discrimination, this is really about charging each consumer the maximum they will pay. Now, it's not easily done, this. So what you've got here is a market-based demand curve, and you are then trying to actually identify a given consumer who would pay price P1 and only receive Q1. Meanwhile, you charge someone else P2, and they then receive up to Q2, and meanwhile you might have a price level of P3 because for that third customer that's all they're prepared to actually pay. So what you are doing here is deliberately charging a price in line with what each of those consumers is prepared to actually pay. Where do we see examples of this? Well, it's hotly contested as to what extent we do see this, because what this really relies upon is the business actually having full and almost perfect information really about the consumers. Now, there is the prospect of this being developed over time as technology continues to improve, of course. Cookies on websites, of course, allow the business to actually see how the consumer is interacting with the site, the decisions that they are making when they're revisiting that site after looking at a previous perhaps flight ticket and so on. And therefore that may enable them to develop more information to utilize almost a type of first degree price discrimination. But of course it is seldom used because we don't often have perfect information about consumers and exactly how much they would pay for a given product. So it's an interesting one. And one other point that I'd just like to make before I move on, I once saw an article in the newspaper saying how Uber and Uber's app actually tells Uber how much battery life their Okay, and so let's now move it on to second degree price discrimination. So this is of course where the price varies according to the quantity demanded of that given product. So if we just consider a demand curve here, let's put in D equals AR. Let's now consider our marginal cost here, and let's say that this consumer is willing to actually buy up to this level. Okay, so they're looking for a low quantity purchase. They are therefore buying a low quantity, and as they buy a low quantity, they have to pay price P1 for it. But as that price, as that quantity increases, it means that you get a better deal. So a medium quantity would then enable the consumer to get a better price at P2. So once again, we can see that occurring, and then when we reach P3, so we've got P3 now, we get a high quantity being provided. So when the consumer is buying in bulk here, we can see that there is a big distinction between the quantities that are actually demanded and the price level. So therefore, it's another good example of price discrimination, and the price is simply varying according to quantity demanded there. And then we're on to the third one. Now this is perhaps the one we've seen most commonly, but of course we do see that even with things like milk. Okay, so we do see second degree price discrimination, even in the supermarkets. If you want to buy 1 pint of milk, well, the price of that first pint of milk is really quite expensive. But if you want to buy 2 litres of milk, you'll actually get a very low price, and it will probably cost you the equivalent of 2 pints of milk. So therefore, buying in bulk means you get a higher quantity, of course, and a lower price level per unit. Excellent. Let's now have a look at our third degree price discrimination. Now, here we're really utilising this point in particular, that there's varying elasticities of demand here. So let's take a look. So it involves charging different prices to different consumer groups. So with peak periods, of course, the demand curve is likely to be quite inelastic. So let's just illustrate that there. I've gone a little bit too inelastic with that marginal revenue. There we go, perfect. Okay, so what we can now see in this industry is during a peak period, we can charge a price level of P1 for a quantity of just Q1. So that's in our peak period. But when it comes to an off-peak period, well, when it comes to train travel off-peak, when it comes to flights off-peak, the demand curve is much more elastic. It's much more price sensitive. And so therefore, the price that consumers can actually enjoy, if they can still consume this product, and some people will be able to, of course, is going to be much, much lower. So let's just highlight that. We're still working on this point, MC equals MR. So as we come across, we can see a price level of P2 and a quantity demanded now of Q2. So this really highlights the distinct difference that we can see in the marketplace, and the fact that during peak periods they will charge much higher prices for goods than in the off-peak periods. Okay, so great stuff. That's all looking really good. Now, it's important to be aware of how consumers could possibly benefit from these scenarios, though, and particularly if we focus in on these two types of price discrimination specifically. So when it comes to our second degree price discrimination, we can see that consumers are actually incentivized to buy more of a given good, and they will therefore receive a lower price. So that would enable a business to actually exploit economies of scale. Of course, if they were buying more of a quantity, they'd get a lower bulk price for it. That makes sense. Now over here we can see, yes, the peak consumers will experience high prices, and that is to their detriment, arguably. But those travelling off peak, they're going to get a much, much better price. And therefore, there's likely to be a high degree of consumer surplus that is actually attainable within that sort of scenario. So there is the opportunity for some consumer groups to really benefit from price discrimination. It's a really, really interesting point, but further to this, remember what we've said here, that if you're increasing revenue and profit of the firm overall, there's the prospect of dynamic efficiency, of course. And if the business is now achieving greater supernormal profits because of utilising price discrimination, then that could be in the consumer's long-term best interests. So there's lots of arguments that you can use both ways here, okay? That it can exploit some consumers, and certainly first degree price discrimination is not very nice for this consumer on P1Q1, but certainly some consumers can benefit. I hope that's been useful, guys. Look forward to seeing you next time.